The pie was still warm when my mother closed the door in my face. I remember that detail more than almost anything else from that afternoon. Not the cold, not the rain that had started somewhere around the Ohio state line and followed me the last 40 minutes of the drive. The pie. Pumpkin, from my grandfather's recipe. The one with the extra cinnamon and the crust I always burned a little at the edges because he liked it that way. I was holding it in both hands, the way you hold something you are proud of, when my mother opened the front door of my parents' house, looked at me the way you would look at a stranger selling something you did not want, and said the sentence that ended my family as I had always understood it. "This Thanksgiving isn't for you, Claire. Not after what you did to your sister." I want you to understand that I had done nothing to my sister. Not that day, not that week, not, as it would turn out, ever, in any way that mattered. But standing on that porch in a light November rain, holding a pie that was going to go cold in my hands because there was nowhere left to set it down, I did not know that yet. I only knew that my mother's face had the particular stillness of a woman who has already made up her mind, and that behind her, through the gap in the doorway, I could see my sister Vanessa standing in the hallway in a cream-colored dress, watching me with an expression I can only describe as satisfied. My father did not come to the door at all. 3 cars were already in the driveway. My aunt and uncle, my cousins, a neighbor's minivan because apparently even the neighbors had been invited this year and I had not. I stood there on the steps of the house I grew up in, 46 years old, a mother myself, holding a pie that smelled like my childhood, while my own mother told me I was not welcome inside it. Somewhere behind me, I heard a car door close. I did not turn around to see who was watching. I already knew. What none of them understood, standing warm and smug behind that door, was that 11 days later, a letter written by a dead man would walk into that same house and take it out from under every single one of them. But I am getting ahead of myself, and if you know anything about how I was raised, you know that getting ahead of yourself was never something I was allowed to do. I was the one who waited. I was the one who watched. I was the one who, for most of my life, believed that patience was a virtue instead of what it actually was, which was a habit built entirely out of never being given a choice. If you've ever had to stand up to your own family, if you've ever stood on a porch somewhere and felt the particular cold of being unwanted by the people who are supposed to want you most, I'd like to know where you're watching this from tonight. Put it in the comments. I read every one, even months later. Even the ones that come in at 3 in the morning when someone else is standing on their own porch, holding their own version of a pie that has nowhere to go. My name is Claire, and this is the story of how my parents banned me from Thanksgiving to protect my sister, and how my grandfather, who had been dead for 9 months by the time any of it happened, reached out from wherever he was and ended them anyway. To understand how I ended up on that porch, you have to go back much further than that November. You have to go back to a kitchen in a small house outside a town in western Pennsylvania, where I grew up watching my mother set 2 different tables in her head long before she ever set one for real. I was the older daughter. Vanessa came 2 years after me, and from the moment she arrived, something in the household architecture shifted in a way that I would spend the next 4 decades trying to understand and, eventually, mercifully, stop trying to understand. It was not that my parents did not love me. I want to be careful here because this is not a story about hatred. It is a story about a particular, ordinary, devastating kind of favoritism, the kind that does not announce itself with cruelty so much as with small, consistent choices made over and over, year after year, until the pattern becomes the architecture of a life. Vanessa was beautiful in the specific way my mother had always wanted to be, She was clever with people, quick with a laugh, effortless in rooms where I felt like I was doing complicated math just to figure out where to stand. My mother, Susan, had grown up working class and married slightly above herself, and there was a version of respectability she had always been chasing, a version that involved cotillions and country clubs, and daughters who married well and photographed beautifully. Vanessa fit that picture. I did not. I was, by every account, the practical one. I got good grades without particular fanfare. I read constantly, quietly, in corners. I did not need much, and so I was not given much, and somewhere in that exchange, my mother and father decided, without ever saying it out loud, that I did not require the same investment my sister did. Not financially, not emotionally. I was the low-maintenance child, and low maintenance, in that house, was treated as a kind of virtue that also happened to excuse neglect. There is a phrase my sister used about me starting when we were teenagers, one she trotted out at family gatherings for the better part of 30 years, always with a little laugh, always with an audience. I want you to remember this phrase because it comes back later, and when it comes back, it will not be funny anymore. Some of us were born interesting, Claire. You were born useful. She said it the first time when I was 16 and had just won a county essay competition that nobody at the dinner table asked me a single question about, because Vanessa had, that same week, been asked to be homecoming princess. She said it again at my college graduation, when she showed up 40 minutes late in a dress that cost more than my tuition payment that semester. She said it at my wedding, at my divorce, at my son's christening. It became something between a joke and a diagnosis, the kind of line a family repeats so often that it stops sounding cruel and starts sounding like fact. I believed it for a long time. I believed I was the useful one, the load-bearing wall nobody thanked, while Vanessa got to be the chandelier everyone admired. There was one person in that house who never once treated me that way, and his name was Walter Bennett, my grandfather, my father's father. Everyone in 3 counties called him Grandpa Walt, and if you had grown up anywhere near Millbrook, Pennsylvania in the last 60 years, there is a decent chance you bought a bag of nails, a length of rope, or a bag of chicken feed from one of his stores. Grandpa Walt built Bennett Hardware and Feed out of a single storefront in 1968, back when he was 24 years old with a young wife, a used truck, and $1,100 he had saved working construction. By the time I was born, there were 6 stores across 2 counties. By the time I was in my 20s, there were 11. He never moved out of the same 4-bedroom farmhouse he bought with his first store's profits. He drove a Ford pickup with over 200,000 miles on it well into his 70s, because, as he told me more than once, a truck that runs is a truck that runs, and a man who trades up out of vanity is a man who has forgotten where he came from. He had not forgotten where he came from, and more importantly, for reasons I would not fully understand until I was standing in a lawyer's office 9 months after his funeral, he never forgot who in his family had. Grandpa Walt used to come get me on Saturday mornings, starting when I was maybe 7 years old. He would arrive in that truck, honk twice, and I would run out before my mother could invent a reason for me to stay home and watch Vanessa's dance recital rehearsal instead. We would drive to whichever store needed him that day, and he would let me sit on a stool behind the register and count out change for customers. And he would introduce me to every single person who walked through that door as my granddaughter Claire, sharpest kid in the county. Nobody else called me sharp. At home, I was steady, I was reliable, I was practical. Grandpa Walt was the only person who ever looked at me like I was interesting on my own terms, without a qualifier attached. He taught me how to balance a cash drawer before I was 10. He taught me how to read a profit and loss statement before I understood long division, sitting me on his lap in the back office of the Millbrook store, running his thick finger down columns of numbers, explaining what each one meant like it was a story instead of arithmetic. He used to say that numbers never lied to you, that people would tell you all sorts of things to make themselves look better, but a ledger, if you kept it honestly, would always tell you the truth eventually, even if it took years. I did not know when he told me that, sitting in that dusty back office smelling like sawdust and coffee, that he was describing the exact mechanism by which he would one day destroy the people who had spent my whole life making me feel small. Vanessa did not care about the stores. She found them boring, dusty, beneath her, in the quiet way she found most things that did not involve attention beneath her. Grandpa Walt used to invite her along too, in the early years, but she would complain within 20 minutes, and eventually he simply stopped asking, and nobody in the family thought that was strange, because by then it had already been decided, silently, by everyone except him, that I was the granddaughter who did the unglamorous work, and Vanessa was the granddaughter who got to be adored. I want to be honest about something, because this story only works if I am. I was not a perfect daughter, and I was not a perfect sister. I had my resentments, and there were years, particularly in my 20s, when I let those resentments curdle into something uglier than I am proud of. I said things to Vanessa once, during a fight over our mother's 60th birthday party, that I regretted for a long time afterward. I am not telling you this story to convince you I was a saint. I am telling it to you because what happened to me was not a punishment for those moments. What happened to me happened because somebody needed a villain, and somebody else had already decided, long before any of this began, exactly who that villain was going to be. My parents' favoritism toward Vanessa was not subtle once you knew to look for it, though I spent decades not looking for it, because it is a strange kind of grief to admit your own parents love unevenly. When Vanessa's first marriage collapsed after 18 months, my parents paid for a 2-week trip to Sedona to help her heal. When my marriage collapsed 6 years later, after my husband left me and our son Ben for a woman he met at a conference in Baltimore, my mother's advice was that I should try harder to hold my family together, as if the dissolving had been a project I had simply failed to manage. When Vanessa wanted to marry Derek Cole, a man who talked constantly about a car dealership he was going to open and somehow never did, my parents paid for the wedding in full, $68,000, a figure I know precisely because I did the seating chart spreadsheet myself, because nobody else in the family could be trusted with a spreadsheet, and because being trusted with spreadsheets and never being trusted with love had by then become the defining shape of my life. When I told my parents I was expecting my son Ben, my mother's first question was whether I was sure I could handle a baby on my own, since by then my husband and I had already begun to unravel. There was no trip to Sedona for me. There was a 15-minute phone call and a suggestion that I consider my options. I raised Ben mostly alone, on a bookkeeper's salary, working for a veterinary clinic in the same town where I had grown up, 3 blocks from the Millbrook hardware store that still had my grandfather's name over the door in the same hand-painted lettering it had carried since 1968. I want you to hold on to that detail because it matters later. I was good with numbers. I had always been good with numbers. Grandpa Walt made sure of that, one Saturday morning at a time for almost 15 years, while the rest of my family decided that being good with numbers made me the practical one, the useful one, the daughter you called when something needed fixing, and never the daughter you called when something needed celebrating. Grandpa Walt's wife, my grandmother, passed away when I was 22, and after that, he lived alone in the farmhouse for almost 2 decades, refusing every suggestion that he downsize, refusing assisted living with the same stubbornness he'd used to refuse trading in that old truck. He was sharp as a blade well into his 80s. He still drove himself to the Millbrook store twice a week to check the books in person, even after he'd technically handed day-to-day operations over to a regional manager. He still called me every Sunday evening at exactly 6 o'clock, and we would talk for 45 minutes about nothing in particular. And those calls were, for years, the steadiest thing in my life. He met my son Ben the day he was born and held him for 2 hours straight in the hospital chair, refusing to hand him to anyone else, including me. He used to say Ben had his grandmother's eyes. He was the only grandparent who came to every single one of Ben's school events, sitting in the back row of gymnasiums in his old barn coat, clapping too loud, the way a man claps when he has decided, on principle, that a child deserves an audience. My parents came to maybe a third of those events. Vanessa came to almost none, though her own 2 children's events, when they came along, were treated like state occasions by the entire family. I am telling you all of this not because it is unusual. If you are watching this tonight, there is a real chance some piece of it sounds exactly like your own family, because this particular shape of neglect, the golden child and the useful child, is one of the oldest patterns there is. I am telling you this because you need to understand the foundation before I show you what was built on top of it, and what it took to finally bring the whole structure down. Grandpa Walt was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer the January before that Thanksgiving. The Thanksgiving on the porch, the Thanksgiving with the pie. He was 86 years old. The doctors gave him 4 to 6 months. He lasted 5, which even the oncologist called remarkable, though I think what was actually remarkable was that Grandpa Walt had never in his life done anything on anyone else's schedule, and he was not about to start with dying. I drove out to the farmhouse 3, sometimes 4 times a week during those 5 months, after work, after picking Ben up from school and dropping him with a neighbor who owed me a favor. I brought groceries. I sat with him while a hospice nurse checked his vitals. I read him the Millbrook store's monthly numbers out loud because he liked hearing them even when he no longer had the strength to review the printouts himself. My mother visited twice a month, always for exactly 1 hour, always commenting afterward on how tired the visits left her. Vanessa visited even less, though she called frequently in the last 6 weeks, a fact I did not think much of at the time, and would come to understand with total, sickening clarity 9 months later. There was one visit, about 3 weeks before he died, that I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count. He was in the hospital bed we had set up in the front room of the farmhouse, thin in a way that still catches in my throat when I think about it, but lucid, sharp, entirely himself behind the illness. I was straightening the stack of mail on his side table, an old habit, the same tidiness he had taught me at that register when I was 7. And he reached out and put his hand over mine, stopping me. "Clarebug," he said, using the nickname he'd given me before I could talk. "Whatever happens after I'm gone, whatever they tell you, whatever they try to make you believe about yourself, you check the mailbox. You hear me? You check it, and you don't let anybody talk you out of it." I asked him what he meant. He just smiled, that small, tired, entirely deliberate smile I had seen him give 100 times across a hardware store counter when he was about to make a decision nobody else in the room understood yet. And he said, "You'll know when it's time." I did not know what he meant. I assumed it was the confusion of morphine, or a metaphor about grief, something poetic and vague that dying people say. I kissed his forehead and told him I loved him, and went home to make Ben's dinner. And I did not think about that sentence again for a very long time. though it would come to matter more than almost anything else anyone said to me in my entire life. Grandpa Walt died on a Tuesday morning in late February, with a hospice nurse present and me holding his hand, my mother having left 20 minutes earlier because, in her words, she could not sit and watch anymore. My father was at work. Vanessa was, according to her own account, on her way, though she arrived 4 hours after he had already passed. Dressed, I noted, with a detachment that surprises me even now, in an outfit that looked freshly pressed for the occasion. The funeral was held at Millbrook Community Church, the same church where he had been an usher for 50 years, and it was standing room only. 3 generations of employees came, customers came. The mayor of Millbrook came and spoke for 6 minutes about what Bennett Hardware and Feed had meant to that town. I sat in the second pew, between my son and my great-aunt Nora, Grandpa Walt's younger sister, a sharp-tongued 81-year-old woman who had never once in her life pretended to like Vanessa, and who gripped my hand through most of the service hard enough to leave marks. After the burial, there was a reading at the offices of Hale and Associates, the law firm that had handled my grandfather's affairs for almost 40 years. Warren Hale himself, gray-haired, precise, a man who had known my grandfather since they were both young enough to still believe the world made sense, read through the primary will in a conference room with dark wood paneling and a view of Millbrook's modest little town square. The primary will was, on its surface, unremarkable. The Millbrook farmhouse and the surrounding 12 acres to be held in a family trust, terms to follow. A modest cash bequest to Aunt Nora. Personal items distributed by a list he had made himself, item by item in his own hand 3 years earlier. Controlling shares of Bennett Hardware and Feed to be distributed per a supplemental schedule. And then, near the end, Warren Hale looked up from the document, folded his hands on the table, and said something that made my mother sit up very straight in her chair. "There is a supplemental matter," he said, "concerning the disposition of certain trust assets that Walter asked me to handle separately and privately according to specific conditions he laid out before his passing. I am not at liberty to discuss the details today. I will simply say that everyone in this family should expect to hear from this office again." My mother asked what that meant. Warren Hale, in the calm, immovable manner of a man who has spent 4 decades being asked questions he is not permitted to answer, simply said that all would become clear in time, and that Walter had been very specific about the timing, and that he intended to honor his old friend's wishes exactly as they were written. I remember Vanessa's face in that moment. I remember it because it was the first time I saw something flicker across it that was not quite composure. It was there and gone in under a second, but I saw it, the way you sometimes see the shadow of a fish move under still water and cannot quite say afterward what shape it was. I did not think much of it at the time. Grief has a way of flattening your attention, making everything feel slightly unreal, slightly delayed, like you are watching your own life through glass. I drove home that evening, put Ben to bed, and sat alone at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, thinking about a truck honking twice in a driveway, about a hand steadying mine over a stack of mail, about a voice telling me to check the mailbox and not let anybody talk me out of it. I had no idea, sitting at that table, that the sentence Warren Hale had spoken in that conference room, "Everyone in this family should expect to hear from this office again," was not a formality. It was a promise. And it was a promise that was, at that very moment, already being kept, quietly, patiently, by a dead man who had understood his family with a clarity none of the rest of us had earned. The months after the funeral moved the way grief months do, in a strange mix of slow and fast, days blurring together, and then suddenly a season had changed and you could not account for where it went. Spring turned into summer. Ben finished 10th grade. I kept working at the veterinary clinic, kept balancing other people's books, kept driving past the Millbrook store on my way to work every morning, and feeling something catch in my chest each time I saw the hand-painted sign. The one Grandpa Walt had refused to update, even when the corporate branding consultants he occasionally humored suggested something sleeker. It was around June that I started noticing things had shifted with my mother. Small things at first. She stopped calling on Sundays the way she used to. An inheritance, I suppose, of the habit I'd built with Grandpa Walt, except she had never actually kept it as consistently as he had. She was distracted during the calls we did have, asking odd, clipped questions about the farmhouse, about whether I had been out there recently, about whether Grandpa Walt had ever mentioned anything to me about his finances toward the end. I told her the truth, which was that I had helped him with day-to-day things, groceries, driving him to appointments, reading him the store numbers, but that Warren Hale had always handled the actual financial and legal matters, and that I had never once touched his bank accounts or his checkbook. My mother's response to that was a long pause, and then a question that landed in my stomach like a stone. "Are you sure about that, Claire? Because there are some things that don't add up, and your grandfather trusted you with an awful lot toward the end." I asked her what she meant by things that don't add up. She said it was nothing, that she didn't want to worry me, and changed the subject. I sat with that phrase for days afterward, turning it over, trying to figure out what could possibly not add up about groceries and doctor's appointments and Sunday phone calls. I found out 3 weeks later at a birthday dinner for my father that I almost was not invited to, which, in hindsight, should have told me everything I needed to know about where this was heading. We were at a restaurant in town, the kind of place with white tablecloths that my parents favored for occasions where appearances mattered, and Vanessa arrived 20 minutes late, as she often did, and sat down across from me with an expression I can only describe now, looking back, as rehearsed. She waited until the appetizers had been served, until my father had opened his gifts, until the whole table's attention had drifted into that comfortable, unguarded place a good dinner creates, and then she said, lightly, almost as an afterthought, that she had been meaning to ask me something. "Claire, do you know anything about withdrawals from Grandpa's account last winter? Because Derek's cousin works at the bank, and apparently there's some kind of discrepancy, and I just thought, since you were out there so much toward the end..." I felt the blood leave my face. I remember the specific, physical sensation of it, a coldness starting at my scalp and working down. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that I had never once touched Grandpa Walt's bank accounts, that Warren Hale handled everything financial, that she could ask him herself if she had questions. Vanessa gave a small shrug, the kind of shrug that is not really a shrug at all, but a performance of one, and said she was just asking, that she wasn't accusing anyone of anything, that it was probably nothing. But I watched my mother's face while Vanessa said it, and I watched my father's face, and I understood, with the sudden, sick clarity you get when a puzzle piece slides into place you did not want it to fill, that this was not the first time this conversation had happened at that table. It was simply the first time it had happened with me sitting there to hear it. I want to pause here and tell you something about how accusations work inside families, because I think it is one of the most under-discussed cruelties there is. An accusation does not need evidence to do its damage. It only needs repetition and a receptive audience and enough time. My mother had apparently been hearing some version of this story from Vanessa for weeks, maybe longer, in private conversations I was never part of. Conversations where I could not defend myself because I did not know I needed to. By the time I found out, the story already had a shape. Grandpa Walt's finances did not add up. I had spent an enormous amount of unsupervised time with him in his final months. I was, everyone in the family had quietly begun to believe, a woman who might have taken advantage of a dying old man's trust. It did not matter that I had never once managed his money. It did not matter that Warren Hale, the actual custodian of every financial decision Grandpa Walt made in his final years, had never once flagged a concern to me. What mattered was that the story was convenient, and it fit a shape my family had been building around me for 40 years, the practical one, the useful one, the one who could believably be capable of something like this, because nobody had ever bothered to actually know me well enough to know that I could not. I drove home from that birthday dinner shaking. I did not tell Ben what had happened. I sat in my car in the driveway for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside, replaying every detail of every visit to that farmhouse, wondering, in the specific paranoid way that false accusations make you wonder about your own memory, whether there was some innocent thing I had done that could be twisted into something else. I called Warren Hale's office the next morning. His assistant told me he was traveling and would return my call within the week. I did not hear back from him for 11 days, and during those 11 days, the story about the missing money kept growing in the spaces I could not see, the way a fire spreads fastest through a wall before anyone smells the smoke. When Warren Hale finally called me back, his voice had a carefulness to it that I did not understand at the time, a lawyer's caution layered over something that, looking back, I now recognize as genuine concern for me personally. He told me he was aware of the concerns being raised, that he could not discuss the specifics of the estate's financial review at that time, but that he wanted me to know, in his own words, that my name had never once appeared in any capacity that troubled him. I asked him directly whether he thought I had done something wrong. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped, and then he said something I did not fully understand until months later. "Claire," he said, "your grandfather knew exactly what kind of person you are. He knew it better than anyone in your family, and he made decisions accordingly, well before he got sick. I need you to trust that, even when it feels like nobody else does. And I need you to be patient a little longer. There are things in motion that I am not permitted to discuss yet, but they were built specifically to protect you, and the timing of when they activate is not something either of us controls." I asked him what things. He told me he could not say. I asked him when I would find out. He told me, in a phrase I would think about constantly over the following weeks, that I would know when the time was right, because the time had already been decided by someone who was no longer here to explain it himself. "You check the mailbox," Grandpa Walt had told me. "You'll know when it's time." I did not understand yet that a dead man had built a mechanism, quietly, deliberately, in the last months of his life, that was designed to activate at the exact moment my family's cruelty toward me reached its peak. I did not understand that the accusation growing in the shadows of family dinners I was not invited to was not simply an accident of gossip. I did not understand that somewhere in a locked file cabinet in Warren Hale's office, there was a sealed envelope with instructions attached to it that had been sitting there, waiting, since before Grandpa Walt had even been diagnosed, and that the trigger for opening it was closer than any of us knew. I only knew that something in my family had shifted, permanently and badly, and that I was standing in the middle of it with no idea how far it would go. I found out 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening, when my mother called and told me, in a voice that had none of its usual softness, that she and my father had decided it would be best if I did not come to Thanksgiving that year. I asked her why. I already suspected the answer, but I needed to hear her say it, because some part of me still believed that if I heard the accusation out loud, plainly, I would be able to argue against it, The way you can argue against a fact, but never quite against a feeling. It's complicated, Claire, she said. Vanessa is very hurt by everything that's come out about Grandpa's accounts, and given everything that's happened, we think it's best if this year's Thanksgiving is a smaller gathering, family only. Family only. I sat with that phrase for a long moment before I found my voice enough to ask her whether I was not, in fact, family. She did not answer that question directly. She told me she had to go, that we would talk after the holidays, and she hung up before I could say anything else. I did not, in that moment, know about the trust. I did not know about the forensic accounting review Warren Hale's office had quietly commissioned at Grandpa Walt's own instruction months before his death. The review that would eventually reveal exactly where the missing money had gone and exactly whose signature had been forged to move it. I did not know that in Warren Hale's file cabinet there was an envelope with my name on it and a second, thicker folder beside it, containing bank records and a private investigator's report and a handwritten letter that would end my family's version of events forever. I only knew that I had been uninvited from Thanksgiving, and that 11 days later, I was going to drive out anyway, because some stubborn, wounded part of me needed to see my mother's face when she said it to me directly, in person, instead of over the phone, where it was easier to be cruel. The 11 days between that phone call and Thanksgiving itself were some of the strangest days of my life, because I moved through them on two separate tracks at once. On the surface, I was simply a woman finishing out a work week, picking up her son from soccer practice, standing in line at the grocery store deciding between two brands of evaporated milk for a pie recipe she was not even certain yet she would be allowed to bring anywhere. Underneath that surface, something else was happening, something slower and colder. A quiet recalibration of everything I had believed about my place in that family. I told exactly one person what my mother had said. I told Ben, not the whole of it, but enough, sitting across from him at the kitchen table on a Friday night with a half-finished pizza between us, that Grandma and Grandpa were having a smaller Thanksgiving this year, and that we might not be going. He looked up at me with the particular stillness 16-year-olds get when they already sense there is more to a sentence than the words in it. And he asked me, very simply, whether it was because of Aunt Vanessa again. I remember not answering him right away. I remember the specific weight of that pause, the way a mother's silence can sometimes say more to a child than any explanation could. Finally, I told him that it seemed that way, yes, and that I did not fully understand it myself yet, and that I was still deciding what I wanted to do about it. What I did not tell him, because I did not yet have the words for it, was that some old, stubborn part of me refused to simply accept a phone call as the final word on whether I belonged in my own family. I had spent 46 years absorbing disappointment quietly, letting decisions happen to me instead of standing in front of them and asking why. I did not fully understand it at the time, but some part of me had already decided the moment my mother said the words family only and hung up before I could answer, that I was not going to let this particular exclusion happen from a distance, filtered through a phone line where it was easy for her to be cold, and easier still for me to simply accept it without a fight. I thought more than once during those 11 days about Grandpa Walt, about the way he used to say that a man who avoids a hard conversation is usually just delaying a harder one. I did not know, of course, that he had already had the hardest version of this exact conversation on my behalf, months earlier, in a lawyer's office none of us knew to look for yet. I only knew that some instinct in me, Something that felt less like courage and more like exhaustion with my own compliance insisted that I show up. I called my mother twice more during that week, and both times the conversation went the same careful, evasive way. She would not fully explain what Vanessa had told her. She would not answer directly when I asked whether she believed I had done something wrong. She kept returning to the same phrase over and over, like a woman repeating a line she had rehearsed until it no longer required her to think about it. "It's complicated, Claire. It's just for this year. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." I remember sitting in my car outside the veterinary clinic after the second of those calls, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular, feeling something crystallize in my chest that had never fully crystallized before. My whole life, I had accepted my family's version of complicated as an explanation that closed a conversation, rather than one that demanded further questions. That afternoon, for the first time, I understood that complicated was simply the word my mother used whenever the truth was too uncomfortable to say out loud, and that I was done letting that word end conversations that mattered to me. Aunt Nora, when I told her I intended to go anyway on Thanksgiving morning, uninvited, did not try to talk me out of it. She only asked me one question, quietly, over the phone. She asked me whether I was going because I believed it would change my mother's mind, or because I needed, for my own sake, to know for certain what kind of family I actually belonged to. I did not have a clean answer for her. I still am not entirely certain, even now, which of those two reasons was truer. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps a person can walk toward a closed door for more than one reason at once, hoping it opens, even while some steadier, sadder part of them has already accepted that it will not. I baked the pie the night before, in my own small kitchen, with Ben doing his homework at the counter beside me, the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filling the house the way it always had, every November of my childhood, in a kitchen that had once belonged to a woman I was not certain I recognized anymore. I followed Grandpa Walt's recipe exactly. The extra cinnamon, the crust left a little too long at the edges because that was how he liked it. And there was something almost unbearably tender in doing that, in following the handwriting of a dead man's careful measurements, while the rest of the family that man had loved was quietly deciding I no longer belonged among them. Ben watched me work in silence for a while, and then, without looking up from his textbook, he said something that has stayed with me since. He said that Grandpa Walt would have wanted me to go. Not because it would fix anything, he said, working it out slowly the way he did, but because Grandpa Walt never once let anybody decide on his behalf what rooms he was allowed to walk into. He said, I ask myself what Grandpa would do, and I always land in the same place. He'd knock on the door. I did not sleep well that night. I lay awake, turning over every version of how the next day might go, rehearsing sentences I never got the chance to say, imagining a version of my mother who might, upon seeing me standing there with a pie in my hands, simply step aside and let the whole ugly misunderstanding dissolve into an ordinary holiday. I want to be honest and tell you that some small, stubborn part of me still believed that version was possible, right up until the moment I actually knocked on that door. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and damp, the kind of low, heavy sky that sits over western Pennsylvania in late November and makes everything beneath it feel smaller. I dropped Ben at his father's around 11, an arrangement we had settled weeks earlier before any of this had a shape, and I remember him hugging me longer than usual in the driveway, saying only, "Call me after, okay?" in a voice that made him sound older than 16. I drove the 40 minutes to my parents' house alone, the pie sitting on the passenger seat in the same spot where, 11 days later, my grandfather's letter would eventually sit, though I had no way of knowing that yet. I remember the specific, mundane details of that drive with a clarity that still surprises me, the way trauma sometimes burns ordinary moments into memory more permanently than the significant ones. A gas station sign missing its middle letter. A dog running loose along a fence line near the county road. The particular static of a radio station losing signal just past the Millbrook town limits, the same stretch of road I had driven 1,000 times as a girl, riding beside Grandpa Walt in that old pickup truck, counting mile markers out loud because he had taught me that numbers, even small, unimportant ones, were worth paying attention to. I turned onto my parents' street a little after 1 in the afternoon, and I saw the cars before I saw the house. 3 of them already lining the curb and the driveway. My aunt and uncle's sedan, my cousin's hatchback, a neighbor's minivan I recognized from a decade of holidays I had actually been welcome at. My stomach dropped the way it does when a small, private hope you have been protecting finally meets the evidence against it. This was not a smaller gathering. This was not family only in any sense that excluded anyone but me. I sat in my car at the curb for almost 4 full minutes before I made myself get out. The pie balanced carefully in both hands, the porch light already on despite the daylight, the way my mother always turned it on for guests she wanted to make certain could find the doorbell easily. I remember thinking, climbing those familiar front steps I had climbed 1,000 times as a child, that I did not feel like a daughter coming home for the holiday. I felt like someone auditioning for a role that had already, quietly, been recast without her. I rang the bell once. I heard footsteps inside, voices trailing off in the front room the way conversation does when someone new has arrived. And then the door opened, and there was my mother, one hand still on the frame, her expression already arranged into the particular stillness of a woman who has rehearsed exactly what she intends to say. That is how I ended up on that porch, holding a warm pumpkin pie that was about to go cold, listening to my mother tell me that Thanksgiving was not for me anymore. None of them had any idea what my grandfather had already set in motion. None of them knew that the envelope in Warren Hale's file cabinet had a trigger condition attached to it, a condition my mother had just personally satisfied by closing that door in my face in front of witnesses. And none of them knew that the woman standing on that porch, humiliated, holding a cooling pie, was not going to spend the next 11 days grieving what she had lost. She was going to spend them finding out exactly what had been waiting for her all along. I drove home from my parents' house that night with the pie still sitting in the passenger seat, untouched, the smell of cinnamon filling the car in a way that felt almost cruel. I did not cry until I reached the edge of town, and when I did, it came in one long, silent wave. The kind of crying that does not make noise because it has been held in for too many years to remember how to be loud. Ben was at his father's house that weekend, which I was grateful for because I did not think I could have explained what had happened without falling apart in front of him. And I had promised myself a long time ago that whatever my family did to me, I would never let Ben watch me collapse the way I had watched my own mother diminish herself for the sake of keeping the peace. I called my great-aunt Nora instead. She picked up on the second ring, and when I told her what had happened, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that I thought maybe the call had failed, and then she said something I will remember for the rest of my life. "That woman," Aunt Nora said, meaning my mother, her own niece by marriage, without a trace of hesitation, has spent 30 years choosing the daughter who flatters her over the daughter who tells her the truth. And I have watched Walter grieve that every single Thanksgiving for as long as I can remember. He saw it, Claire. He saw all of it. And knowing my brother the way I knew him, I would bet every dollar I have left that he did not just sit there and watch it happen without doing something about it. I asked her what she meant. She told me she did not know exactly, that Grandpa Walt had always kept his own counsel about his private affairs, but that in the last year of his life, he had made several trips into Millbrook alone, unannounced, without telling anyone in the family where he was going, and that when she had asked him about it once, over coffee at her kitchen table, he had simply smiled and told her that a man ought to leave his affairs in better order than he found them. That night, I did not sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through every memory I had of Grandpa Walt in his final months, every visit, every phone call, every strange, quiet comment that I had let pass without examining too closely at the time, because I had been too busy grieving to notice I was also being told something. "You check the mailbox. You'll know when it's time." I thought about Warren Hale's careful voice on the phone, the way he had told me there were things in motion he could not discuss, things built specifically to protect me. I thought about the flicker I had seen cross Vanessa's face in that conference room, the shadow of a fish moving under still water. I thought about my mother's phrase, "family only," and the particular cruelty of being told, by the woman who raised you, that you had somehow stopped counting as family at all. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, lying awake in the dark, I made a decision. I was done waiting to be told what was happening to me by people who had already decided, long before I had any say in it, what kind of daughter I was allowed to be. I was going to find out the truth myself. The next morning, a Friday, I called Warren Hale's office before it opened and left a message asking for the first available appointment. His assistant called back within the hour, which told me something had shifted, because in the 11 days after the funeral, it had taken over a week to get a call back at all. She told me Mr. Hale could see me Monday at 9 in the morning, and that he had specifically asked her to tell me to bring nothing, that he would be providing everything I needed. I spent the weekend in a strange, suspended state, going through the motions of ordinary life, taking Ben to his soccer game, grading nothing because I was not a teacher, but doing the equivalent, the small domestic tasks that keep a household running, while underneath all of it my mind kept circling back to that phrase. He would be providing everything I needed. On Monday morning, I dropped Ben at school and drove to the offices of Hale and Associates, a converted Victorian house on Millbrook's Main Street that had served as the town's most trusted law office for 3 generations. I had been there once before for the initial will reading, sitting in the second row of that dark-paneled conference room while my family absorbed a version of my grandfather's wishes that none of us yet understood was incomplete. Warren Hale met me at the door himself, which surprised me. He was a tall man in his late 60s, silver-haired, precise in his movements in a way that had always struck me as reassuring rather than cold. And that morning, for the first time since Grandpa Walt's death, I saw something in his expression that looked almost like relief. "Claire," he said, shaking my hand with both of his, "I have been waiting 9 months to have this conversation with you. Please, come in." He led me not to the conference room, but to his private office, a smaller room lined with legal volumes and, on one shelf, a framed photograph of himself and Grandpa Walt standing in front of the very first Bennett hardware and feed store, both of them decades younger, both of them grinning like men who had just gotten away with something wonderful. He sat behind his desk, folded his hands, and looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "Your grandfather," he said, "came to me almost exactly a year before he died, before any cancer diagnosis, before any of what followed. He came to me with a concern, and he asked me to help him address it in a very specific way. I want to tell you about that conversation now, because the condition he attached to sharing it with you has just been met." My heart was pounding. I asked him what condition. He told me, Warren Hale said, that if he passed before he could resolve the matter himself, and if his family, in his absence, excluded you from a family gathering, that would tell him everything he needed to know about which direction things had gone. He was very specific about the word exclude. He used it more than once. He said, and I remember this precisely because I wrote it down at his request, "If they shut Claire out of that house, Warren, you'll know it's time. Not before, only then." I sat there in that small office, feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath me, understanding for the first time that my grandfather had anticipated this exact moment, this exact betrayal, more than a year before it happened, with a clarity that made my chest ache in a way I did not have words for yet. "He knew," I said quietly. "He knew this would happen." "He suspected it," Warren Hale said gently. "He had watched this family for a long time, Claire, longer than you have in some ways, because he watched it without the particular blindness that comes from being inside it. He loved your parents, he loved Vanessa, but he was not foolish about what they were capable of, and in the last 2 years of his life, he became aware of something specific that changed how urgently he moved." I asked him what that was. Warren Hale reached into a drawer of his desk and withdrew a manila folder, thicker than I expected, and set it on the desk between us without opening it. "In the spring before his diagnosis," he said, "your grandfather noticed discrepancies in his personal checking account. Small at first, a few $100s here, a few hundred there. He kept his own ledger, as I understand you know, a habit from his early years in business, and he noticed the bank statements did not match his handwritten totals. Being the man he was, he did not confront anyone. He came to me, and I recommended a forensic review." My mouth had gone dry. "And what did the review find?" Warren Hale opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of checks, bank statements with sections highlighted in yellow, and a typed report bearing the letterhead of a private investigation firm I did not recognize, Delgado Forensic Associates. "Over an 18-month period," he said, $46,300 was withdrawn from your grandfather's personal account through a combination of forged checks and unauthorized transfers. The signature on the checks was a very good forgery, Claire. Good enough that your grandfather's own bank did not flag it initially. But it was not his signature. Frank Delgado's team was able to trace the funds to a specific pattern of deposits and payments made by your sister Vanessa, and by extension, her husband Derek, whose used car dealership venture, it turns out, was significantly more insolvent than the family had been led to believe. I could not speak for almost a full minute. I sat there, staring at the photocopied checks, at the careful, damning yellow highlighting, at my sister's forged approximation of our grandfather's signature, a signature I had watched him write 1,000 times across a hardware store counter, and I felt something break open inside my chest that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but some terrible combination of both. "She let them blame me," I finally said. "She knew what she'd done, and she let my parents believe it was me." "Your grandfather suspected exactly that would happen," Warren Hale said quietly. "It is why he moved as quickly and as carefully as he did once the diagnosis came. He did not have the strength, in his final months, to confront Vanessa directly. He was not certain, frankly, that a direct confrontation would produce the outcome he wanted. Vanessa is, by all accounts, a very capable liar under pressure. So instead, he built something more durable than a confrontation. He built proof, and he built protection." I asked him what he meant by protection. Warren Hale reached into the same drawer and withdrew a second item, a sealed envelope, cream-colored, slightly yellowed at the edges from 9 months in that file cabinet, with my name written across the front in my grandfather's unmistakable, blocky handwriting. "Claire. This," he said, sliding it across the desk toward me, "is for you." He wrote it 4 months before he died, On a day he came to this office alone, without telling anyone in the family. I have kept it exactly as he left it. He asked that I not read it, and I have honored that. What I can tell you is what accompanies it, structurally, in the estate. He explained, in the careful, methodical language of a man who had spent 40 years making complicated things comprehensible to grieving families, that Grandpa Walt had established an irrevocable trust roughly 14 months before his death, well before the cancer diagnosis, transferring title of the Millbrook farmhouse, the same farmhouse my parents had been living in for the past 6 years after downsizing from their own home under the guise of caring for him in his old age, into that trust with a single named beneficiary. Me! The trust had a delayed activation clause, Warren Hale continued, fully legal, fully binding, drafted with extreme care specifically to avoid any appearance of undue influence, since your grandfather was, at the time of signing, in perfect health, and fully independent counsel confirmed his competency in writing. The clause specified that the trust would formally activate and transfer full title 9 months after his date of death, automatically, requiring no further action from anyone on a date certain. I asked him what that date was. Warren Hale looked at me steadily. December 3rd, he said, 11 days from now. I sat in that office for a long time after he told me that, turning the sealed envelope over in my hands, feeling the weight of everything that had just been laid in front of me settle slowly into place. My grandfather had suspected, more than a year before his death, that his family's cruelty toward me would eventually reach a breaking point. He had built a legal structure, quietly, methodically, using the same patient thoroughness he had once used to build 11 hardware stores out of a single storefront and $1,100. And he had set that structure to activate at almost exactly the moment his suspicions were finally confirmed. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked. "Why let me sit through months of accusations, months of my mother questioning whether I'd stolen from him without saying anything?" Warren Hale's expressions softened into something that looked almost like grief of his own. "Because he asked me not to, Claire. And because I believed, and still believe, that he was right to ask it. He told me that if I revealed any of this too early, your family would find a way to contest it, to muddy it, to make it about anything other than what it actually was. He wanted the proof to be undeniable before anyone in that family had the chance to prepare a defense against it. He also told me something else, something I think about often." I asked him what. He said that you had spent your whole life being asked to prove you deserved love in that family, and that he refused to let his final gift to you become one more thing you had to fight for before you'd even been allowed to open it. He wanted this to be undeniable, not a maybe, not a possibly. He wanted it to be a fact so solid that not even your mother could argue her way around it. I did not open the letter that day. Warren Hale offered me privacy in his office to read it, but I found, holding it in my hands, that I was not ready. Some part of me understood that once I read my grandfather's final words to me, something in this whole terrible year would become permanently, irreversibly real, and I was not yet steady enough to carry that. Instead, I asked Warren Hale what came next. "The formal reading of the supplemental trust and the estate's remaining provisions," he said, "was originally scheduled for December, timed to coincide with the trust activation. I intend to move forward with that as planned, on December 3rd, in this office, with the full family present. I will present the forensic findings. I will present the trust documents. And you, Claire, if you are willing, will read your grandfather's letter aloud yourself, at the moment I believe he intended it to be read." I asked him if he was certain that was what my grandfather wanted. Warren Hale nodded slowly. He told me in this very office, the day he wrote that letter, that he trusted you to know exactly what to do with the truth once you had it. He said you were the only person in that family who had ever learned to read a ledger honestly. He said the rest of them only ever wanted the numbers to say something flattering. But you, Claire, he said you always wanted them to say something true. I drove home that afternoon in a kind of daze, the sealed envelope sitting on the passenger seat where the pumpkin pie had sat 11 days earlier. And I understood, somewhere on that quiet stretch of county road between Millbrook's Main Street and my own front door, that everything about the next 11 days would determine not just how this story ended, but who I was going to be on the other side of it. I had spent 46 years being the practical one, the useful one, the daughter who absorbed disappointment quietly so the family could keep its comfortable version of itself intact. I did not know yet, driving home that afternoon with my grandfather's unopened letter beside me, that I was about to spend the next 11 days becoming someone else entirely. But I knew this much. Whatever was written in that envelope, whatever my grandfather had built in that trust, whatever Frank Delgado's forensic report ultimately proved, it was mine now. Mine to carry, mine to use, mine to decide what to do with. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that felt less like a burden and more like a door, finally, quietly, opening. I called Aunt Nora that evening and told her everything. I could hear her set down whatever she was holding, could hear the particular silence of a woman absorbing something enormous, and then she let out a long breath and said something that made me laugh for the first time in 11 days. A small, startled laugh, but a real one. "Well," she said, "I suppose your grandfather finally found a way to have the last word with your mother after all. God knows he tried enough times while he was alive." I asked her if she would come with me on December 3rd. She did not hesitate for even a second. "Claire," she said, "I have been waiting 9 months for someone in this family to finally do something about the way that girl treats you. I would not miss it for anything on this earth." That night, after Ben had gone to bed, I sat alone at my kitchen table with the sealed envelope in front of me, and I finally opened it. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten in my grandfather's careful, deliberate script, the same handwriting I had watched fill ledger after ledger across a lifetime of Saturday mornings. I am not going to read you every word of it now, because I want to save the fullness of it for the moment it was meant to be heard, the moment it was written for, in that conference room, in front of the people who needed to hear it most. But I will tell you the first line, because I have never been able to say it out loud without my voice catching, even now, even after everything that came after it. It read, "Clairebug, if you are reading this, it means they finally showed you who they really are. And I am so sorry I was not there to stand between you and it." I cried for a long time after reading that line. Not the wounded, humiliated crying of the porch 11 days earlier, but something cleaner, something closer to relief, the particular grief of finally being seen by someone, even if that someone had to write it down before he died, because he knew he would not live to say it in person. I read the rest of the letter that night, and I read it again the next morning, and I would read it perhaps a dozen more times over the following 11 days, each time understanding some new layer of what my grandfather had built, quietly, patiently, in the last year of his life, entirely for me. None of my family knew, as that week began, that I had already read it. None of them knew about Frank Delgado's report, about the forged checks, about the trust that would activate in 11 days and hand me title to the house they were currently sitting in, planning what remained of their holiday season without me. They had no idea what was coming, and I intended, for the first time in my entire life, to make absolutely certain they found out exactly the way my grandfather had planned for them to. The 11 days between that meeting in Warren Hale's office and December 3rd did not feel like 11 days. They felt like a held breath, the kind you take right before you dive into cold water, your whole body bracing without quite knowing yet how deep the water goes. I did not confront my family. This was, I want to be clear, entirely deliberate. Warren Hale had explained to me, in careful, measured language, exactly why the timing mattered. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood the wisdom in it. My grandfather had not built a trap out of anger. He had built one out of thoroughness. The same thoroughness he had used to grow 11 hardware stores out of a single storefront. And thoroughness does not rush. Thoroughness waits until every piece is verified, every document notarized, every signature compared, so that when the moment comes, there is no crack in the foundation for anyone to slip through. I went back to work at the veterinary clinic that Tuesday, and I remember sitting at my desk that afternoon, reconciling invoices for flea medication and boarding fees, feeling the strange dissonance of doing something so ordinary while carrying something so enormous. Nobody at that clinic knew that the quiet woman doing their books had, the day before, learned that her sister had forged her dying grandfather's signature to steal $46,000, and that in 11 days, the house her parents were living in would legally become hers. I did not tell anyone at work. I told exactly 3 people during that period, and each of them mattered for a specific reason. The first was Ben. I want to talk about this carefully, because how you tell your child that his family is more complicated and more broken than he understood is one of the hardest conversations I have ever had, and I do not think I got every part of it right. I sat him down on a Wednesday evening, after his homework was finished, and I told him, in language calibrated for a 16-year-old who was old enough to handle the truth, but young enough that I still wanted to protect him from the worst edges of it, that his Aunt Vanessa had done something very wrong involving Grandpa Walt's money, and that his grandparents had believed her instead of me, and that in a couple of weeks, everyone was going to find out the truth together, at the same time, in a lawyer's office. Ben was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked me the question that, of everything anyone said to me during those 11 days, has stayed with me the longest. Are you going to be mean about it, Mom? When you tell them? I asked him what he meant. I don't know, he said, working through it slowly, the way 16-year-olds do when they are feeling their way towards something they cannot quite articulate yet. Grandpa Walt was never mean to anybody, even when people deserved it. He just kind of, I don't know, let the truth do the work. I guess I hope you can be like that. Not because they deserve it, because you're better than that. I did not expect my son to be the one to hand me the emotional compass for the next 11 days, but he did. And I have thought about that sentence, "You're better than that," more times than I can count in the months since. It became, in a real sense, the standard I tried to hold myself to when the moment finally came. Not cruelty, not spectacle for its own sake, just the truth, laid out plainly, allowed to do its own work. The second person I told was Aunt Nora, though by then she already knew most of it from our phone call. What I told her in person, over coffee at her kitchen table the following weekend, was the specific content of Grandpa Walt's letter, and I watched her face as I read certain passages aloud, watched decades of quiet grief on his behalf move across her features. "He talked to me about this family more than you know," she said when I finished. "Not the details, he was too private for that, but the shape of it. He used to say your mother married status instead of character, and that Vanessa learned early that status was the only currency that got rewarded in that house, so naturally that's the only currency she learned to deal in. He worried about you the most, Claire. Not because you needed the most help, because you needed it and never once asked for it, and that combination, he used to say, was the most dangerous thing a family could do to a person. The third person I told, carefully, and only after significant thought, was a woman named Dolores Abernathy, an old friend from my college years who had gone on to become a family law attorney in Pittsburgh. I did not need her professionally, not exactly, but I wanted a second set of eyes on the trust documents, someone with no personal stake in the outcome who could confirm, independently, that everything Warren Hale had described to me was as legally solid as he claimed. Dolores reviewed the documents over a long lunch on a rainy Thursday, reading through pages of legal language with the particular focus of someone who has spent a career learning to find the cracks in things. When she finally looked up, she set the papers down and looked at me with an expression somewhere between professional respect and personal astonishment. "Claire," she said, "I have reviewed a lot of trusts in my career, and I have rarely seen one drafted this carefully. Whoever wrote this was not just protecting an asset, he was building something specifically designed to survive a legal challenge. The independent competency evaluation alone, done before diagnosis, with a notarized statement from a second physician confirming no undue influence, that's not standard practice. That's a man who anticipated exactly the fight his family might try to bring, and closed every door before they even knew there was a fight coming." I told her about the forged checks, about Frank Delgado's forensic report. Her expression shifted into something colder, more precise. "That's not a family dispute anymore, Claire," she said. "That's felony forgery and theft from a vulnerable elderly person. Pennsylvania takes financial exploitation of the elderly very seriously, especially with documented forensic evidence like this. Your sister is looking at real legal exposure here, not just an awkward family conversation." I had not fully let myself think about that dimension of it, the possibility that this would not stay contained within a family conference room, that it might follow Vanessa somewhere far more serious. I asked Dolores what she thought I should do with that information. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that echoed, almost exactly, what Ben had told me a few nights earlier. "That's not a legal question, Claire. That's a question about who you want to be when this is over. The law will do what the law does regardless of what you decide. But how you handle the decision of whether to press it, that's yours and yours alone to make." While I was quietly gathering myself, quietly consulting attorneys and rereading my grandfather's letter and preparing Ben for what was coming, my family, entirely unaware of any of it, was living out the final days before December 3rd exactly as they always had, believing themselves safely in control of a story I had already, secretly, begun to take back. I learned some of what happened during that period only afterward, pieced together from things Aunt Nora heard, from things Warren Hale's office observed, from a conversation I eventually had much later with my father, in a moment of rare and painful honesty. But it is worth telling here, because it shows you something important about how confident cruelty can be, right up until the exact moment it discovers it was never as safe as it believed. Vanessa, it turns out, had spent the weeks after Thanksgiving telling an expanded version of her story to anyone in the extended family who would listen, embellishing the alleged financial misconduct further each time she told it, until, by the account Aunt Nora eventually pieced together from a cousin's wife, I had apparently gone from someone suspected of taking money from Grandpa Walt to someone who had, in one particularly creative retelling, been quote-unquote systematically draining his accounts for years while pretending to help him. My mother, for her part, had thrown herself into the holiday season with what I can only describe as performative enthusiasm, hosting a smaller, more intimate Thanksgiving that she described to the extended family as cozy and healing, language that, when I heard about it later, made something in my chest tighten with a very particular, very old kind of pain. Healing from what? I remember thinking. Healing from me. Derek, meanwhile, according to what surfaced much later in Frank Delgado's supplementary findings, had used a portion of the stolen funds not for household expenses, as Vanessa would eventually claim in her own defense, but to make a down payment on a boat, a decision so staggeringly tone-deaf that when it finally came out, even my father, sitting in that conference room on December 3rd, could not muster a defense for it. I want to be fair here because fairness matters to me, even in a story like this one. I do not believe Vanessa woke up one day and decided to become a person capable of forging her dying grandfather's signature. I believe, from everything I eventually learned and everything I already understood about the shape of our childhood, that she had spent her entire life being told, implicitly and explicitly, that she was entitled to more than she had, that appearances mattered more than substance, that being loved required being impressive rather than being honest. I believe my parents built the conditions for exactly what happened, year after year, choice after choice, gift after gift, compliment after compliment, until they had raised a daughter who genuinely believed that taking what she needed and blaming someone else for it was simply how the world worked for people like her. That does not excuse what she did, but it explains it, and there is a difference between the two that I think matters, especially now, looking back on all of it with whatever wisdom 9 months and 11 days and one devastating letter can buy a person. 3 days before December 3rd, something happened that Aunt Nora described to me over the phone with unmistakable satisfaction in her voice. Something that told me, even before the formal reading, that the ground beneath my family's feet had already started to shift, whether they understood why or not. Vanessa, it seemed, had gotten wind, through a mutual contact whose cousin worked as a paralegal at Hale & Associates, that I had visited Warren Hale's office twice in the previous 2 weeks, and that Frank Delgado's name had been mentioned in connection with some kind of financial review. This information, garbled and second-hand as it was, reached Vanessa on a Tuesday evening, and by Wednesday morning, according to Aunt Nora, who heard about it from my mother directly, Vanessa had shown up at my parents' house in what my mother described as an agitated state, demanding to know what I was, in her words, trying to pull. My mother, apparently, had tried to reassure her that it was nothing, that I had probably just gone to discuss some routine matter related to the earlier will reading, but Aunt Nora told me that even over the phone, she could hear something different in my mother's voice by that point, a thread of uncertainty that had not been there before, the first small crack in a confidence that had been built on nothing sturdier than convenience and a preferred version of events. Warren Hale, for his part, moved the formal notice up by 2 days once he became aware, through his own channels, that word of the review had begun to leak. He did not want, he told me later, to give anyone in the family enough time to attempt any kind of preemptive damage control, whether that meant liquidating remaining funds, coordinating a unified story, or worse, attempting to contest the trust before it fully activated. On a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week before December 3rd, certified letters went out from the offices of Hale & Associates to my parents, to Vanessa and Derek, to Aunt Nora, and to me, formally requesting attendance at a reading concerning the estate of Walter Bennett, to be held at 9 in the morning on December 3rd. Attendance described in the letter, deliberately, as mandatory to determine final distribution of the estate. I received my copy of that letter on a cold Thursday afternoon, standing at my own mailbox at the end of my own driveway, and I stood there for a long moment, snow just beginning to fall around me, thinking about a truck honking twice, about a hand steadying mine over a stack of mail, about a voice telling me, months before any of this had a shape I could recognize, that I would know when it was time. It was time. I want to take a moment here to describe what those final 7 days felt like, because I think it matters, and because I do not want you to walk away from this story believing that what I felt in the run-up to December 3rd was triumph. It was not triumph. Not yet. What I felt, mostly, was grief, moving alongside something harder and steadier, the way two rivers run parallel for a long stretch before they finally meet. I grieved, in those 7 days, for the family I had spent my whole life wishing I had, the one where being useful and being loved were not two separate categories, the one where a daughter did not have to wait for her grandfather's death to finally be believed. I grieved for the version of Vanessa I might have had, if either of us had been raised differently. The sister who might have stood beside me instead of building a story designed to bury me. I grieved for my mother, too, in a strange and complicated way, because somewhere underneath the woman who had closed a door in my face, there had once been a woman who held me as a baby and believed, however imperfectly, that she was doing right by both her daughters. And alongside all of that grief, quietly, steadily, something else was growing. Not vengeance, exactly. I want to be precise about the distinction, because it matters to how the rest of this story unfolds. What I felt was closer to clarity, the particular, hard-won clarity of a woman who has spent her entire life being told a story about herself that was never true, finally holding in her own two hands undeniable proof that it was never true at all. I spent those 7 days preparing, in the practical sense, the way my grandfather had taught me to prepare for anything that mattered. I met with Warren Hale twice more to review exactly how the reading would proceed. I reviewed Frank Delgado's forensic report until I understood every line of it well enough to explain it to anyone who might question it. I read my grandfather's letter one final time, slowly, deliberately, the night before, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a single lamp on, memorizing not the words themselves, which I already knew by heart, but the feeling of them, so that when I stood up to read them aloud, my voice would not shake. Ben asked me, the night before, whether I was scared. I told him the truth, which was that I was not scared of what I was about to say, because everything I was about to say was true. And truth, my grandfather had taught me, does not require courage to speak. It only requires the willingness to finally stop protecting the people who have been lying. What scared me, I told Ben, was not the reading itself. What scared me was the moment right after it, the moment where I would have to decide, standing in front of the family that raised me, exactly what kind of person I wanted to become on the other side of finally being believed. December 3rd arrived cold and clear, the kind of sharp, blue-skied winter morning that feels almost cruelly beautiful, given what it is about to hold. I dressed carefully that morning, not in anything ostentatious, my grandfather would not have wanted that, but in a single, simple charcoal dress I had bought for the occasion, the first new piece of clothing I had bought myself in longer than I could remember that was not purchased for someone else's benefit. Aunt Nora picked me up at 8:30, then stayed home, at his own request, saying he did not need to watch it happen, that he trusted me to tell him about it afterward, and that his job that morning was simply to have hot chocolate ready when I got home, whatever the outcome. I have thought about that small, steady kindness many times since, the particular grace of a 16-year-old who somehow already understood, better than most adults I knew, exactly what kind of support a person needs on the hardest morning of their life. Aunt Nora and I did not talk much on the drive into Millbrook. There was not much left to say that had not already been said in the 11 days before it. When we pulled into the small parking lot behind Hale and Associates, I saw my parents' car already there, and beside it, Vanessa and Derek's, a newer model than I remembered, and it occurred to me, with a strange, distant clarity, that the money for that car had very likely come from the same account Frank Delgado's report had traced so carefully. We walked in together, Aunt Nora's hand steady on my arm, and Warren Hale met us at the door of the same conference room where, 9 months earlier, my family had first heard the words everyone in this family should expect to hear from this office again. The dark wood paneling looked the same. The view of Millbrook's town square looked the same, snow dusting the courthouse steps outside. But everything else about that room, I understood the moment I stepped into it, was about to be entirely different. My parents were already seated at the long conference table, my mother in a cream-colored coat she had not yet removed, my father beside her, his expression carefully neutral in the way he adopted whenever he did not know which direction a situation was going to break. Vanessa sat across from them, dressed, I noted, in a manner that suggested she still believed this was a formality, a final routine detail before an inheritance she had already begun spending in her head. Derek sat beside her, checking his phone, a detail that would later strike me as almost darkly comic given what was about to unfold. My mother looked up when I walked in, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, or discomfort that I had come at all, given how our last real conversation had ended. "Claire," she said, her voice carrying that particular brightness she used when she wanted to smooth over something uncomfortable in front of an audience. "I didn't realize you'd be joining us." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply said, evenly, I was invited, same as everyone else. Warren sent the letter himself. I took a seat at the far end of the table, Aunt Nora beside me, and Warren Hale closed the conference room door and took his own seat at the head of the table, a thick folder in front of him. And beside that folder, a single sealed manila envelope that I recognized, with a small jolt, as a duplicate copy of my letter, the one Warren Hale would use to read the primary passages aloud, since he had insisted, wisely, that a formal legal record of the reading existed independent of my personal copy. "Thank you all for coming," Warren Hale began, in the same measured, unhurried voice he had used 9 months earlier. "We are here today to finalize the distribution of the estate of Walter Bennett, in accordance with a supplemental trust structure and a personal letter he prepared prior to his death, both of which activate under conditions that have now been formally satisfied." My mother shifted in her seat. "Conditions?" she asked. "What conditions, Warren? We were told there was a delay clause, but nobody explained what it actually meant." "I'll explain everything," Warren Hale said. "I ask that everyone hold their questions until I've finished the initial presentation. There is a great deal of material to cover, and I want to make certain it is understood correctly and in full before we discuss what it means." He opened the thick folder first. "As some of you are aware," he said, "in the spring, prior to his diagnosis, Walter became concerned about discrepancies in his personal checking account. He engaged this office, and through this office, a forensic financial investigation firm, to review those discrepancies. That review was completed shortly before his death, though its findings were sealed at his specific instruction, to be presented only under conditions he outlined to me personally. Conditions I am not at liberty to have disclosed earlier, but which I can now share in full. I watched my mother's face as Warren Hale spoke. I watched the particular stillness settle over her. The stillness of someone who senses a wave building offshore long before it reaches the beach. Warren Hale withdrew the photocopied checks from the folder, and one by one laid them on the table, sliding copies to each person present. Over an 18-month period, he said, his voice steady, clinical, the voice of a man who has done this exact kind of difficult work more times than he would like to count. $46,300 was withdrawn from Walter Bennett's personal account through a series of forged checks and unauthorized transfers. The room went very quiet. Forged, my father repeated, picking up one of the photocopies, studying it as though staring at it hard enough might change what it said. Forged how? By whom? Frank Delgado's forensic team traced the funds through banking records, deposit patterns, and handwriting analysis, Warren Hale said. Their findings, which I have here in full, along with sworn documentation, identify the signatory as Vanessa Bennett Cole. The silence that followed lasted, by my later recollection, somewhere close to 10 full seconds, though at the time it felt considerably longer. I watched Vanessa's face. I want to describe it honestly, because I have thought about it many times since, and I think the honesty of that moment matters more than any embellishment I could add to it. She did not look surprised. Not at first. She looked, for just a moment, like a woman doing rapid arithmetic behind her eyes, calculating exactly how much room she had left to maneuver. Then, gathering herself, she laughed, a short, sharp, disbelieving sound. "That's absurd," she said. "That's completely absurd. I never touched Grandpa's checkbook. Warren, with all due respect, I don't know what kind of investigator you hired, but this is insane." "I understand this is difficult to hear," Warren Hale said, with the unshakable patience of a man who had clearly anticipated exactly this response. "Which is why I want to walk through the evidence carefully, rather than simply asserting a conclusion." He proceeded, over the next several minutes, to lay out Frank Delgado's findings in methodical detail. He showed handwriting comparisons, Vanessa's known signature from a leased apartment application beside the forged checks, the similarities damning even to an untrained eye. He showed deposit records tracing the withdrawn funds into an account jointly held by Vanessa and Derek, an account that, 6 weeks after each forged check cleared, had made payments toward the down payment on a 22-foot boat purchased the previous summer, registered in Derek's name. My mother made a small sound at that, something between a gasp and a word that did not fully form, and I watched her look at Vanessa with an expression I had genuinely never seen on my mother's face before in my entire life. It was not anger, not yet. It was the beginning of disbelief curdling into something far worse, the specific horror of a parent realizing that the child she had spent her whole life defending might not, in fact, deserve the defense. "That boat," my mother said slowly. "You told us Derek's business partner helped with that." Vanessa's composure, for the first time, genuinely cracked. "Mom, this is ridiculous. I'm not going to sit here and let some lawyer with a grudge against me try to—" "I have no grudge, Vanessa," Warren Hale interjected, calm and immovable. "I represented your grandfather for nearly 4 decades. My only obligation in this room is to honor his wishes exactly as he expressed them to me, and to present the facts as his own investigation uncovered them. I would encourage you to consider carefully how you respond to what I'm about to say next, because everything I am presenting today is independently verifiable, and much of it has already been reviewed by outside counsel at Claire's request. I felt every eye in the room turn to me at that. I did not flinch. I simply nodded once, confirmed it. There's more, Warren Hale continued. Walter did not simply document the theft. He anticipated, correctly, that if he confronted Vanessa directly in his final months, he risked either a denial he could not disprove in the time he had left, or worse, a family rupture severe enough to threaten his other, more important intentions. So instead, he built protection. 14 months before his death, well before his diagnosis, he established an irrevocable trust transferring title of the Millbrook farmhouse into a structure with a single named beneficiary, activating automatically 9 months after his date of death. My father, who had been silent for most of this, finally spoke, his voice tight. "What beneficiary, Warren?" Warren Hale looked directly at me for a moment before he answered, and I understood, in that look, that he was giving me the chance to speak first if I wanted it. I did not take it. I let him finish. "Claire," he said simply. The room seemed to tilt. My mother's hand went to the edge of the table, steadying herself against it. "That's our house," she said, her voice rising for the first time. "Warren, that's the house we've lived in for 6 years. That can't be. Walter would never—" "Walter did," Warren Hale said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. "The trust activated this morning, at midnight, automatically. Title has already transferred and been recorded with the county. This is not a proposal for discussion. It is a completed legal fact." I watched my mother's face collapse into something I had genuinely never witnessed in her before. A kind of horrified, disbelieving grief. The particular grief of a woman realizing, all at once, in front of witnesses, exactly how badly she had misjudged the shape of her own family. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would he do this to us?" Warren Hale did not answer that question. Instead, he reached for the sealed envelope and looked at me. "Claire," he said gently, "your grandfather left a letter, addressed to you, that he asked to be read aloud today, in this room, in front of your family. I have my own copy for the legal record, but he specifically asked that you be the one to read it, if you were willing." I was willing. I had been willing for 11 days. I stood up slowly, and I felt Aunt Nora's hand briefly press mine beneath the table before I moved away from her, a small anchor of steadiness before I walked to the head of the table where Warren Hale rose and offered me his own copy. The pages I already knew by heart from a lamp-lit kitchen table 3 nights earlier. I looked out at my family before I began. My mother, ashen, her cream coat still buttoned, one hand pressed against her mouth. My father, staring at the table, unable to meet my eyes. Vanessa, pale now, all her earlier bravado drained away, watching me with something that looked, for the first time in my memory, like actual fear. Derek, silent, his phone finally put away. "This is what my grandfather wrote to me," I said, and I began to read. "Clairebug, if you are reading this, it means they finally showed you who they really are. and I am so sorry I was not there to stand between you and it. I have watched this family for a long time, longer than any of you know, and I have watched the particular way this family loves. It loves loudly, when loving is easy, when it makes for a good photograph or a good story to tell the neighbors. And it loves quietly, or sometimes not at all, when loving requires something harder, something without an audience to perform for. You were always the daughter who loved without an audience, Claire. You loved me on Saturday mornings nobody else wanted to spend with an old man in a dusty hardware store. You loved me in hospital rooms and hospice beds, in the unglamorous hours nobody photographs. And I want you to know, before anything else in this letter, that I saw every single one of those hours, and I never once mistook your quiet love for something small. It was the largest love in that entire family, and it was the one they valued the least. And that has broken my heart for longer than you know. My mother made a sound, something choked and small, but I did not stop. I do not know exactly what happened to bring you to this letter. I do not know if it was the money or something else entirely. Some other cruelty this family found its way to without my knowledge. But I know my son, and I know your sister, and I have watched them, for years, build a house out of appearances. And I have watched them ask you, over and over, to be the invisible load-bearing wall that kept that house standing while they got to be the parts everyone admired. A house built that way always falls eventually, Claire. I could not stop it from falling. But I could make certain that when it did, you would not be standing underneath it. You would be standing somewhere safe, with the deed to something solid in your hands, and the truth, finally, undeniably, on your side. I paused there, my hands steady despite everything, and I looked up briefly. Vanessa had begun to cry, silently, her mascara streaking, though I could not yet tell whether it was grief or the beginning of panic. I looked back down and continued. I know what your sister did with my checkbook. I want you to know that I knew, before I died, and that I chose not to confront her, not because I forgave it, but because I understood that confrontation without proof simply becomes another story this family tells about you, Claire. Another version of events where you end up somehow at fault for having noticed. So I built proof instead. I am not a cruel man, and I take no pleasure in what this letter is about to cost your sister. But I built 11 hardware stores on the belief that a ledger, kept honestly, always tells the truth eventually. I believe the same is true of a family, and it is long past time this one told the truth. The house is yours now, Claire, free and clear, along with the acreage around it. I know you may not want to live in it, given everything, and that is your choice entirely to make. What I want you to understand is that it was never really your parents' house to begin with, no matter how comfortably they settled into believing it was. It was mine, and I am giving it to the granddaughter who actually earned a place in it, 1,000 small Saturday mornings at a time. I have also arranged, separately, for controlling shares in Bennett Hardware and Feed to transfer to you, along with a modest continuing role for your father on the board, should he choose to remain involved, and should his conduct in the years ahead merit that continued trust. I built those stores to serve this town, not to be a trophy for people who never once stepped behind the counter. I am trusting you, Claire, to decide what they become next. I want to say one last thing, and then I will let you go, because I know reading this in front of them is going to take more out of you than they will ever understand. Do not let this turn you bitter. I watched bitterness eat at people my whole life, watched it hollow them out from the inside until there was nothing left but the grievance. You are better than that. You were always better than that, even when nobody else in that house seemed capable of noticing it. Be fair, be firm, but do not become someone who needs their suffering in order to feel whole. You already are whole, Clarebug. You have been whole this entire time. It just took the rest of them far too long to see it. I love you more than I ever found the right moment to say out loud while I was alive. I am sorry for that. Consider this letter my very late attempt to fix it. Your Grandpa Walt. I set the letter down on the table, and for a long moment, nobody in that room said anything at all. My mother was crying openly now, her hand still pressed against her mouth, her shoulders shaking in a way I had never once seen in 46 years of knowing her. My father sat frozen, staring at the table, at the photocopied check still spread out in front of him, at a version of his family he had apparently never once let himself see clearly until this exact moment. Vanessa was the first to break the silence, and when she did, it was not with an apology. "This is insane," she said, her voice shaking, half defiant, half collapsing. "He's dead. You can't just take our house because a dead man decided he liked Claire better. This isn't fair. None of this is fair." "Fair," I said, "and I want you to understand that I did not raise my voice because I had promised Ben I would not, because my grandfather had asked me not to become someone who needed her suffering to feel whole, and I intended to honor both of those promises exactly. You forged his signature, Vanessa. You stole $46,000 from a dying old man, and when the money didn't add up, you let our parents believe I had done it. You let Mom accuse me at Dad's birthday dinner in front of the entire family. You told her to ban me from Thanksgiving. Explain to me which part of any of that was fair." Vanessa opened her mouth and closed it again. For the first time in my entire life, my sister had nothing to say. I looked at her for a long moment, and then I said the thing I had thought about saying for 11 days, the thing that had been sitting in my chest since a dinner table years earlier, since a homecoming princess crown and a college graduation nobody asked about, and a wedding I paid for with my own careful spreadsheet while receiving nothing in return. "Some of us were born interesting, Vanessa," I said quietly. "You were born useful. Useful for keeping this family's story straight, as long as the story was about you. I hope it was worth it." I watched something in her collapse completely at that. The exact phrase she had thrown at me for 30 years handed back to her, transformed, no longer an insult, but a verdict. My mother finally found her voice, though it came out broken, smaller than I had ever heard it. "Claire," she said, "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know she—" "You didn't want to know," I said. And I said it gently because some part of me, even then, still loved her, still grieved for the mother I had wished she could have been. You believed her because believing her was easier than believing me. You have been doing that our entire lives, Mom. This is just the first time it cost you something you couldn't get back." Warren Hale allowed the room a long moment before he spoke again, his voice returning to its careful, procedural register, the voice of a man steering a wounded family back toward the practical matters that still needed handling. "There are decisions to be made here," he said, "regarding restitution and regarding whether formal criminal charges will be pursued. Under Pennsylvania law, financial exploitation of a vulnerable elderly person carries significant penalties, and the evidence here, I want to be direct about this, is more than sufficient to support prosecution should the estate, through Claire as beneficiary, choose to pursue it." Vanessa's face drained of what little color remained in it. Derek, beside her, finally spoke for the first time since the meeting began, his voice thin. "Please," he said. "Claire, please, we have kids. If this becomes a criminal case, we lose everything, please." I sat with that for a long moment. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters more than the neat, satisfying version of this story where the villain simply gets what she deserves and everyone claps. I felt no satisfaction watching Derek beg. I felt, mostly, a tired kind of sorrow for two small children who had done nothing wrong and would nonetheless carry the weight of their parents' choices for years, the same way I had carried the weight of choices that were never mine to begin with. "I'm not interested in destroying my sister's family," I said finally. "I'm interested in the truth finally being told, and in making sure something like this can never happen to anyone else in this family again. Warren, I'd like to discuss a restitution structure, full repayment of the $46,000 supervised by your office with a reasonable timeline. If that repayment happens in full and on schedule, I will not pursue criminal charges." I looked at Vanessa. "But I want to be very clear about something. This is not forgiveness. I am not interested, right now, in rebuilding a relationship with you. What I am interested in is fairness and accountability, and making sure my son grows up watching his mother handle betrayal with dignity instead of cruelty. That's what this is. Not mercy for your sake, dignity for mine." Vanessa nodded, silently, tears still streaking down her face, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my sister looked at me not with the practiced condescension of 30 years, but with something that looked almost like the beginning of genuine shame. I turned to my parents next. My mother was still crying, quietly now, and my father had finally lifted his eyes from the table to look at me, his expression unreadable in a way that told me he was still, even now, struggling to fully absorb what had happened. "As for the house," I said, "you have 90 days to make arrangements for alternate housing. I'm not going to put you out on the street in the middle of winter. I'm also not going to pretend the last 9 months didn't happen. I'll help you find something appropriate. But that house is mine now, and I intend to keep it." "Then's college fund," I added, looking specifically at Warren Hale. "The one Grandpa Walt set up years ago. I want confirmation today that it's untouched and separate from any of this." Warren Hale nodded. "It has been fully verified as untouched. $62,000, exactly as your grandfather structured it, held in a protected education trust that none of the recent activity affected in any way." I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. The meeting continued for another hour after that, working through the practical logistics that always follow a moment like this: restitution schedules, the transfer paperwork for the farmhouse, a conversation about the ongoing management of Bennett Hardware and Feed that Warren Hale walked through carefully, explaining the structure my grandfather had built for the company's continued operation under my controlling interest. My father spoke to me only once more before the meeting ended, catching me by the elbow as I gathered my coat. His voice low, hoarse, the voice of a man who had aged a decade in the span of 2 hours. "Claire," he said, "I don't expect you to forgive us. I wouldn't, in your position. I just want you to know that your grandfather was right about something he used to say to me, more than once over the years. He used to tell me I was raising 2 daughters and only paying attention to one of them, and I used to tell him he didn't understand, that things were more complicated than that. He was right. I didn't understand. I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to finally see it." I did not have a full answer for him in that moment. I still do not entirely, even now. What I told him, standing in that hallway with my coat half on, was the truest thing I had to offer. "I believe you're sorry, Dad," I said. "I don't know yet if that's enough to build something back on, but I'm willing to find out, slowly, if you're willing to actually do the work instead of just saying the words." Aunt Nora drove me home that afternoon, and we did not speak much, again, on the way, though this time the silence felt entirely different than it had that morning. It was not the silence of dread anymore. It was the silence of two people who had just watched something enormous and necessary happen, and needed a little time before either of them had words adequate to the size of it. When she dropped me at my house, she reached over and squeezed my hand before I got out. "Your grandfather," she said, "would be so proud of you today. Not for the house, not for the company, for how you did it. He always said the measure of a person isn't what they do when they finally get power. It's what they do with it once they have it. You just showed this whole family what that actually looks like." I walked into my own house that evening to find Ben waiting exactly as he'd promised. 2 mugs of hot chocolate already made, sitting slightly cooled on the kitchen table, because he hadn't known exactly when to expect me. He looked up when I came in, studying my face carefully, the way he had studied it since he was small, trying to read whether the news, whatever it was going to require him to be strong for me, or whether I was, for once, going to be okay on my own. "How'd it go?" he asked. I sat down across from him, wrapped both hands around the warm mug, and told him, as simply and honestly as I could, everything that had happened. He listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, turning something over in his mind. "Were you mean?" he finally asked, echoing the question he'd asked me a week earlier. I thought about it honestly before I answered. "I don't think so," I said. "I told the truth. I set boundaries. I didn't scream and I didn't gloat, even when part of me wanted to. I think I did exactly what Grandpa Walt would have wanted me to do." Ben nodded, satisfied, and took a sip of his cooling hot chocolate. "Good," he said, "because you're better than that, just like Grandpa was." The months that followed were not, I want to be honest with you, a straightforward march into a happy ending. Real life does not resolve as neatly as the version of this story you might expect, and I think it does a disservice to anyone listening who has lived through something similar to pretend otherwise. Vanessa's marriage to Derek did not survive the fallout. The restitution payments strained finances that had already been stretched thin by a boat neither of them should have bought in the first place, and within 8 months they had separated. Derek moving into an apartment across town, Vanessa and her 2 children moving into a smaller rental closer to my parents. A considerable downgrade from the life she had spent years curating for public consumption. I did not celebrate this. I want to be clear about that. I felt, when I heard the news through Aunt Nora, mostly a quiet, tired sadness for the children caught in the middle of consequences that had never been theirs to earn. My parents moved out of the Millbrook farmhouse within the 90 days I had given them, into a smaller condominium on the other side of town. I helped them, in the end, more than I initially planned to, driving over on 2 separate weekends to help my mother pack, working alongside her in a silence that was, for the first time in a long time, not entirely uncomfortable. We did not talk much about what had happened during those weekends. We talked about small things, about which boxes went where, about a chipped teacup she had almost thrown away that I asked her to keep, because I remembered her using it every Christmas morning of my childhood, and some part of me still wanted her to have that, even now. My relationship with my mother, in the year since, has become something neither fully broken nor fully repaired, a careful, slowly rebuilt thing that I am not certain, even now, will ever return to what it might have been if none of this had happened. She calls me on Sundays now, at 6 o'clock, the way Grandpa Walt used to, though I do not know if she chose that time deliberately, or if it is simply a habit she absorbed from watching me keep it with him for so many years. We talk for 20, sometimes 30 minutes. It is not everything I once wanted from her, but it is more honest than anything we had before. And I have come to believe that honest and imperfect is worth infinitely more than polished and false. My father has taken his continued board role at Bennett Hardware and Feed seriously, in a way that has genuinely surprised me. He shows up to meetings prepared. He asks good questions. Warren Hale, who sits in on quarterly reviews as a courtesy to the estate, told me once, with something close to wonder in his voice, that my father seemed like a different man in those meetings than the one he remembered from decades of handling the family's legal affairs. I do not know if that change is permanent. I have chosen, for now, to let it be enough that it is real in the present. Vanessa and I have spoken exactly 4 times since December 3rd, each conversation shorter and more careful than the last. She has, to her credit, made every restitution payment on schedule, the final one arriving 3 weeks ago, closing out the account Warren Hale set up to track it. She sent, along with that final payment, a letter of her own, handwritten, considerably shorter than our grandfather's had been, and considerably less eloquent, but genuine in a way that surprised me. In it, she wrote that she had spent months in therapy, something I did not know until I read it, trying to understand why she had done what she did, and that the answer she kept arriving at was not a satisfying one. Only that she had spent her whole life believing that being loved required being extraordinary, and that somewhere along the way, extraordinary and entitled had become the same thing in her mind, and she had never once questioned it until she had no choice left but to. I do not know if Vanessa and I will ever be close again, in the way sisters are supposed to be close, the way I once, as a little girl, hoped we might be. I have made peace with the possibility that we will not, but I have not closed the door entirely, and I think that, too, is something my grandfather would have wanted. Some careful, hard-won middle ground between bitterness and blind forgiveness. As for the farmhouse, I did move in, eventually, about 6 months after that December morning, once the practical matters of my old house sold and Ben's school situation was settled comfortably. I sit some evenings in the same front room where Grandpa Walt's hospital bed once stood, in a chair by the same window, and I think about a truck honking twice in a driveway, about a hand steady over a stack of mail, about a voice telling me I would know when it was time. I run Bennett Hardware and Feed now, not entirely alone. We have a wonderful regional manager who handles much of the daily operations. But the decisions that matter, the ones about the company's direction, its values, its place in this town, those are mine to make now. And I make them the way my grandfather taught me, sitting on a stool behind a register when I was 7 years old, learning that a ledger kept honestly always tells the truth eventually. Ben works at the Millbrook store on weekends now. The same store, the same counter, learning the same lessons I once learned. And there is something in watching him count out change for a customer, something in the particular pride on his face when someone recognizes the Bennett name and says something kind about what it has meant to this town, that feels like a circle finally closing the way it was always meant to. I want to close this story the way I think my grandfather would have wanted it closed, not with triumph, though there is some of that in it, and not with bitterness, though there was certainly cause for it. I want to close it with the thing he actually taught me across all those Saturday mornings, all those quiet, patient lessons behind a hardware store register. If you have ever been the practical one in your family, the useful one, the one who absorbed disappointment quietly so that everyone else's comfortable story could stay intact, I want you to hear this clearly. You were never less interesting. You were never simply useful. You were, this entire time, the load-bearing wall that kept something standing that never once thanked you for it. And there is nothing shameful in that. There is, in fact, a particular kind of strength in it that the golden children of this world rarely have to develop because they have never once had to survive without it. I do not know what final letter, what final trust, what final quiet act of justice is waiting somewhere in your own future. I hope, for your sake, it does not take losing someone you love to finally receive it. But I want you to know that the truth, kept honestly, the way my grandfather taught me to keep a ledger, does eventually surface. It may take months, it may take years, it may, as it did for me, take a dead man's letter, opened in a lawyer's office on a cold December morning, to finally set it right. But it comes. Be patient. Be fair, even when fairness is not returned to you. Do not let what was done to you turn you into someone who needs another person's suffering in order to feel whole. But do not, under any circumstances, spend one more year of your life shrinking yourself to fit inside a story that was never built with room for the truth of who you actually are. If this story found something true in your own life, something familiar in a family that loved unevenly, or a truth that finally arrived later than it should have, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, and if you have your own story of finally being believed, I hope you'll share it. If this resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so more stories like mine can find the people who need them. My grandfather used to say that a man ought to leave his affairs in better order than he found them. I think, in the end, he did exactly that, for his stores, for his town, and most of all, for me. And I intend to spend the rest of my life doing the very same thing, for my son, and for whoever comes after him, so that the ledger, kept honestly, keeps telling the truth for a long, long time after I am gone too.